And a couple of things that I want to, before we get into this argumentation paper, a couple of things I want to mention. The first is at the end of the semester, I always round up grades. So for example, if you end up with a high B, it will round to an A. A high C will round to a B, high D will round to a C, and so forth. Please be aware that for most programs, you do have to receive a C or better to be considered, to move on to the next level of instruction and to have that considered successful, that you've successfully taken the course. Also, a couple of other things. One, I have finished looking at your issue proposals. It is crucial that you go back and take a look at those and make sure that your issue is approved. In several cases, you still received credit for the issue proposal, but I suggested you might want to change your topic or at least have a backup topic, and I tried to type at the comment. I didn't record feedback on the issue proposals, but at the very top, I typed a comment, and it either said issue approved, or if the issue was not approved, I explained why. Now, some of you did not receive credit for an issue proposal because you chose, either you plagiarized, copied information offline, and pulled it into your issue proposal, and that is clearly plagiarism, or you wrote an issue proposal about one of the off-limit topics that was listed on the argumentation guidelines. I totally understand, which we're about to go over, I totally understand that I hit you with a lot of information really quickly. And so I know that you didn't catch every detail, but I could not give you credit if you chose a topic that already said, please don't choose this. And we're going to go over that again in a minute. But what I have done is given you the opportunity to now to email me a new issue proposal and on a different topic, and I'll give you credit for it as well as look over it. The other thing I want to mention is if you were not successful with the definitions right and the comparison contrast with research essay, you're not going to be successful with this paper unless you suddenly learn something about documentation. Because 9 times out of 10, if you scored below what would be considered a C, the problem had to do with your documentation, your source material, or unintentional plagiarism. Now, with both of those assignments, I have given students the opportunity to redo them in preparation because I see them as stepping stone assignments for this last big research paper. And even this is not that lengthy, quite frankly. It's double the size and scope of what you've done for me in the past, but that's still not very long for a research paper, quite frankly. But you had to take advantage of that opportunity by meeting with me in a virtual meeting using Blackboard Collaborate. If you still would like to redo your definition right, and several students took advantage of that, and I hope that they've now positioned themselves, not only improved their grades on those 2 assignments or one or both, but also they positioned themselves well to do well on this last paper. Because again, if you didn't pass one of those other 2, you're not going to pass this one because the problem probably had to do with research and documentation. And you've got to address that before you try and do something else that contains research and documentation if you've got issues. I hope that makes sense. So please don't hesitate to email me if you want to redo one of those assignments. But in order to redo it, you have to meet with me first. It takes about 15 minutes. We review documentation individually. I show you how to fix whatever it is you did, and then you resubmit it. Okay. All right, so let's begin by taking a look at the guidelines, and I'm going to add a little bit more information than what is on the actual sheet. And again, I realize that there's a lot of information here, and so I'm going to slow it down for a minute and explain some of the thinking behind the assignment. Now, please remember that this is an academic argument, which means that you're writing at the college level and you need topics that kind of lend themselves well to this kind of assignment. Also be aware that we're out of time. I mean, we literally, the last day of class is July 26th. I think that's 2 weeks from yesterday. You know, we can fudge a day or two more if you need it, but I have to turn in grades by that Friday. So we have to be done. So that does not give you a lot of time. And there's certain topics that are easier to research and write about than others. So please be aware of that, because there are a lot of interesting, some of you wrote some very interesting issue proposals, but the challenge is going to be, you've got a clear idea in your mind about what you want to do. But the reality is that trying to find academic level information that would be considered non-biased and acceptable and data-driven. The definition right, I believe, is the week, maybe it's the week 6 folder. I'll have to look. Week 6 or week 7. Maybe it's week 7, yeah. Week 7. Those have been graded, and again, I wrote some notes at the top. If you did not make, those were 50-point assignments. If you didn't make at least a 35 on that assignment, that probably means there's something wrong with the documentation, and I'm giving you the chance to redo it after you meet with me. Okay. So some topics are going to be easier than others to do this particular assignment, and we're out of time. So let's begin by talking about the parameters for the assignment. First of all, it is 150 points because it's longer. It's going to take you a bit more effort and work. So the word count this time is 1250 to 1500. Again, I am having to count off because some of you are overwriting. You are putting everything you think that you can, that you can find into a paper when I've given sort of a specific guideline here. And again, one of the goals of this particular class is to help you. It's sort of what we call a gateway class to help set you up to be successful writing papers in other classes. And so that's teaching you how to write to fit other assignments. As far as going back and redoing the definition right, you can't actually redo it necessarily. You can't actually do it for the first time. It was due weeks ago. So, but email me after this, Trey, and I'll be glad to talk with you about it if you can sort of tell me what happened there. All right, so the length is 1250 to 1500 words. 1100, okay. Again, we can fudge a little bit down to 1100 to 750 is still acceptable. Shorter than 1100, you haven't done enough research, you don't have enough to say about your topic, or your focus is too narrow. 750, more than 750 words in the paper, and you're not controlling your research. You're letting it control you. A few years ago, I had a student who the paper he turned in was 3,500 and something words. He literally just put everything he found into this paper, and the problem was it didn't meet this first requirement. Okay. Number 2, the topic has to be debatable. That means people disagree, and not just that they disagree because here's the thing about opinions, right? We all have one. That doesn't make necessarily a good topic for a paper, but there's disagreement, and there is reliable, unbiased, factual support for both sides. There are some things that people disagree about, but quite frankly, there's nothing to support their side, So what we're looking for, again, because we're looking at at college level writing and writing argumentation, which is different from persuasion. Argumentation is a form of persuasion, but it's a more formal type of writing that was established actually back with not the writing, but actually speaking with the ancient Greeks, which is what we'll talk about in a second. Persuasion, persuasion can often be thought of as even more emotional. Argumentation is based on logic. It's based on the brain, on reasons and facts and data. It's very data driven. Versus just sort of an emotional appeal, although you can use emotional appeals. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. So you want to make sure that your issue is debatable. There's more than one side. And of course, this is where you turned in your issue proposal so I could take a look at it, make sure you're on the right track. There were a couple of you that I actually mentioned, from the direction that the issue proposal went by the time I got to the concluding paragraph, the paper became more informational. It sounded like you wanted to find out information, not argue a point. And you've got to remember that the goal of this assignment is that you argue the point. That's one of the biggest problems that some students have, is they end up writing an information paper. It's very interesting. It contains a lot of good data, but they don't really argue anything, or they don't argue anything until they get to the conclusion, and that's where they take a stand. And that's not an argumentation paper, okay? Please note, check your issue proposal. It's got to be approved before you begin research. It will be a shame if you draft a paper that I cannot accept because I already told you your topic wasn't suitable. Please notice that it doesn't have to be about controversial or big, broad topics or social issues. It can be something very specific. It can be something local. I've had students who, for example, took a look at bullying in their particular school system, and that's what they chose to write about, the way that it was currently handled, and they did research and suggested a better method of handling bullying at this particular elementary school. I mean, it was the research wasn't specific to that location, but they were able to find some national solid research and bring it in to their paper. Now, here's the off limits part, okay? Because I did very clearly identify these topics right here. All right, gun control, capital punishment, which means the death penalty, anything having to do with guns and whether they're controlled or not, abortion, and animal testing. And the main reason that I have taken these topics off the table, all right, is because I've taught research writing for over 30 years, and these are the most common topics that students immediately go to. And quite frankly, I know a lot has happened, a lot is happening, concerning gun control, concerning abortion, capital punishments coming up a little bit here and there in some states. But quite frankly, I don't want to read about it anymore. That's just my personal bias. I don't want to read about these topics. So because I've read so many papers, I mean, that's it. Now, speaking of bias, I want to backtrack for a second. You know, if I do my job well, you will never know my politics. You'll never know my specific religious beliefs, or if I even have any, because that's not my role. My role is to help you improve your writing. So I will approach your paper as a neutral reader, okay, a neutral audience. Please understand that. But that's the reason, in order for me to be able to do that, I have to, things that I'm tired of reading about, I just kind of had to put that out there. All right. Also, please note, if you've done research in the past, you can't bring it in on this assignment. This is supposed to be new research that you've done specifically for this. And of course, you can't recycle an old paper. All right. Now, I want to take a second here and talk a minute about finding a good topic. There was a textbook that I used to teach from years ago, and let me share this whiteboard. And it came up with specific questions that you should ask yourself as you're determining whether or not an issue, a topic, is a good one for argumentation. So here are some of the questions that it said that you should ask. Is the issue settled or resolved? I can't talk and type at the same time. If so, obviously it's not something that needs to be rehashed. This happens every once in a while, okay? Is it debatable? We've already talked about that. There's more than two sides to the issue, and both sides have reliable, fact-based, unbiased information to support them, all right? That makes the topic debatable. All right, number 3. Now this one is the tricky one. I want you to choose a topic that you care about, that interests you, and that you're willing to spend a little bit of time digging into. However, if you are so kind of closed-minded about your issue, your paper is probably not going to be very effective. Now, again, you are writing an argument, you are debating a particular side, that stays the same, but please be aware that you have to let the information help you go a certain direction. If you're too rigid, especially in research writing, if you're too rigid about what you want to do, you're going to find this to be a very frustrating assignment, okay? And so the reason that it kind of asks, you know, one of the questions is, will you consider a position different from your own? When you get into it, you may find that the information leads you a different direction. Are you willing to go with that direction is really the question. Again, that may make the paper better if you actually let the information help dictate the stand that you take. I've had this happened in the same semester. I had two students who wanted to write about the legalization of marijuana. One was against it, one was for it. By the time each of them finished doing their research, and they used different source material, but the student who was for it was then against it, and the student who was against it was then for it. So I can't explain how that happened, but it did. Are you interested, engaged? I mean, do you care? Again, we don't have a lot of time for you to have to worry too much about this, but the best papers are usually the ones that people are invested in and at least want to find out more information about. Next one, is this a safe issue for you? Occasionally I have students who've had traumatic events in their lives and they want to write about something involving that trauma. Often if you haven't worked through it and if the subject topic is not safe, one of two things will happen. Either the student will back off so much from the topic that there's nothing specific in it. They almost are emotionally distancing him or herself from it, or the opposite will happen and he or she will be so emotionally connected to the topic that that they cannot kind of take, for example, my feedback. It feels too personal. The whole thing feels too personal, and they don't have any objectivity to see how they need to change the writing. So that's a question to ask too. I didn't really see any topics though in the issue proposals that seem to go that direction. The next question has to do with what we call common ground. In argumentation, you are trying to get someone to change their mind, or at least to listen to what you have to say, to read what you have to say, maybe to take some action. The goal is not just to express your opinion. That's a different form of persuasion. It's usually based more on emotion and so forth. The goal of this is to actually impact an audience, to get the audience to your reader, and in this case it will just be me since we're not sharing papers. We just don't have time for that. But the goal is to have students or the audience, you know, consider what you're saying. And often we do that best when there's some common ground, where there's some overlap between our interests or our desires or something. So that's something to consider as well. The next question was the one I was trying to help you with the issue proposal. Is there enough adequate information? And again, for some topics, and I usually let you know at the very top of the issue proposal if I thought you were going to have problems with this. Let's see, that's sort of enough question. Please, enough questions to ask yourself to think about your topics. I always recommend that you have a backup. Is as you get into it, and if you find that for some reason this is not going to work for you, or you're having trouble finding information, you want to be able to switch really quickly. Now, if you switch topics, I'm not going to ask you, unless I already have asked you to redo an issue proposal because you didn't receive credit for one of the reasons I mentioned before. But if you do change topics, I'm going to ask you to email me. You don't have to go through a whole issue proposal process if you've already received credit for it. But I'm going to ask you to email me your new topic and let me sort of make sure that you're headed the right direction. I just don't want anybody devoting a lot of time to something that's not going to work. All right. All right, so I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions about this so far? Okay, if not, let's a couple more comments about these guidelines and then we'll continue. Please notice this is a requirement. You must use at least 5 separate sources that you find during the research process to develop this paper. A source is a separate bibliographic, a separate article, separate newspaper article. It doesn't mean you use the same couple of sources 5 times in your paper, right? There are 5 separate sources. Also, please notice that 3 of them, and this is a requirement, must come from the GNTC databases and Primo. You don't want to build a paper from Credo reference sources, by the way. That's kind of like going to an encyclopedia. It's kind of the same thing that you would have done back in middle school, high school, where you use encyclopedias. Credo is a great place to get 1, maybe 2 sources, but that's usually more like background information. Instead, use Primo for most of the research that you do. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't use a popular search engine like Google or Bing or so forth, but remember that it is on you, the writer, to go through that process of evaluating source material that we've already worked on in the middle of the semester. You know, evaluating sources. Are they biased? Is it credible? Is there depth? You know, how recent is the information and so forth. That's on you if you go outside of the GNTC databases. Anything you find within the databases is considered reliable and you don't have to worry about it. All right. Direct quotations. Most of your information should be paraphrased or summarized in your paper. No more than 20%, now notice 20% of the paper should be directly quoted. Again, in my experience, having taught high school, but primarily college at a couple of universities, in my experience, students, you know, need to move away from copying and pasting and relying too heavily on direct quotations. But please hear me, that's not saying you shouldn't use them. They're very important, but they should be used sparingly, you know, whenever something's so beautifully worded that if you actually try to put it in your own words, you would never, you know, you couldn't do it justice, or if the person that's you're quoting is an authority, or if someone's expressing his or her opinion and you want to let them do the talking. Now, if you haven't already noticed, in the last few assignments that we've included for research, let me remind you of how you can tell, and this will take a second to set it up. But let me remind you of how you can tell whether or not, and I'm going to show you a student paper from last semester, and this is how you can tell the actual percentages of direct quotations and use it as a form of plagiarism checking for direct quotations. Here on the right-hand side, I realize your screen looks different when you open Feedback Studio, but on the right-hand side, the blue buttons, of course, whatever your blue tabs you have up here are what reveal my comments, both written and recorded. The red includes the similarity report. So, for example, in this particular paper, this student, if you select whatever number this is, it will highlight all of the passages in the paper that the system has found that were copied word for word. Okay, so notice this student's paper is coming in at 7%. This was a draft. Now notice that does not mean that they're plagiarized. If she handles the information correctly, if you handle the information correctly, it's not plagiarized. And by correctly, that means 2 things when you're dealing with words copied word for word. You put them in quotation marks, all right, to indicate these are not my words, this is this person's words, and you include in-text citations. Now, sometimes, I want to show you this, sometimes it's very clear that, the student has used sort of common phrases and words that are relatively close together in this one source, number 4 here. And you can actually click on that and it will show, if it's a student paper, it will tell you that it's proprietary information. But what Turnitin does is when you upload a paper, it takes your paper and it compares it to all of the student papers in its database, from colleges and universities across the country. And so that's the first thing it does. So if you end up with a match with another student paper, it simply means you and that student used the same source. It doesn't mean you copied that student paper, okay? I'm quite aware of that. Also, please be aware, I don't consider this plagiarism. The guideline is 5 or more words in the same order as the original. If the phrase is not a common one, you need to put in quotation marks if you copy it word for word. Now, as we scroll down, you should be able to see here, like, for example, this: unrealistic, thin, lean, and toned to beauty ideals for women and muscular and lean body ideals for men. And then here's our in-text citation. By the way, this is what your final paper is supposed to look like. And I am counting off now because this is what our 4th, 5th, 6th assignment where you've had to use this. The page is supposed to look like this. Up left-hand corner, you have the header, title centered, and notice it's not in bold. Notice all the main words are capitalized. Then double space between the lines, not the paragraphs, and the first line of each paragraph indented. Again, we've been using the same format throughout the semester, so it does count off now if you're not, time's up, okay, as far as grace on that. So you've got to make sure you're using a format that looks like this. But again, it's not plagiarism. It's highlighting that she copied this, but she's already put quotation marks to show she copied it. And then there's her source. If we scroll down through here, here's another one, and this was copied word for word. She put it in quotation marks, then here's her source. So she's documented it. So the same thing here, right? And notice these are just pieces of sentences, but she's indicating that she did copy it word for word, and then here are her references at the end, and the information's tied to this. Now, this was a draft. It was incomplete. She had several more sources to go to add, but anyway, this is how you can check and see what your percentage is. If this red number is higher than, let's just say 21, 22%, then you need to go back and paraphrase or summarize some of that material, write it in your own words, okay? Again, select the number and it'll highlight it for you, but be sure and document it. Up to 22%, not a problem. More than that, the paper's choppy and you're not correctly handling the information, okay? Any questions about that? All right, then we'll continue. Oh, one of the things I wanted to, that was also part of that paragraph, is that you may use one piece of field research. Now, I don't think anybody's going to have time for field research, but I want you to be aware of what it is. Field research is research that you yourself actually conduct. And it doesn't mean looking for secondary information by going online and looking at essays. It means an interview, a survey, or a direct observation. So, for example, if you know someone who's experienced in your subject matter and is some type of expert and you want to interview him or her, that can be one of your sources. Okay, there are usually formal ways that you do that, where you actually have questions in advance, that you actually set up the email, you take notes, and so forth. I will put this PowerPoint, I'll upload it in the week 9 folder so you can take a look at it. Observations are where you actually kind of go and sit and watch and look and so forth. For example, I had a student who wanted to talk about the best ways to use discipline, and she was an pre-K student, pre-K teacher, and she worked in a daycare, and she was looking for, her research paper was about the best ways to discipline toddlers, for example. And so what she did was she arranged to sit in several different instructors' rooms, and then she took notes throughout the whole thing, and she used some of her observations about the use of discipline, and that was one of her sources. Finally, surveys, but surveys take a little time, and again, we're out of time. But I just wanted you to be aware this is what we refer to when we refer to field research. That's when you come up with a list of questions. And of course, I think Facebook has a feature. A lot of social media now has survey features. There's also a free service called surveymonkey.com where you can create a survey and email it out to people and have them return it to you. Now, again, there's certain guidelines about doing surveys. For example, you want to make sure that you're using a wide distribution of people, not just sending it to the people you know agree with you, that kind of thing. thing. I had a student who was a Marine, and she wanted to write about women being front lines in combat. So she created a survey, distributed it to the people in her particular group. I don't know if it's a platoon or what. Anyway, got the information, compiled it, and used it, the results of the survey, as one of her sources. So I wanted you to be aware of that. And again, I'll upload this PowerPoint in the Week 9 folder, and you can look at it more closely if that interests you. All right, back to the guidelines. Let's wrap this up, and then we can move on about how to go about conducting this, this research. And let me add some information to it. Again, format I just showed you. Title, again, needs to be relevant to the subject matter. When we are talking, again, about writing argumentation, we are talking about logical appeals, okay? Logic, appeals to your head. Reasons, statistics. I mean, if you think about being in a court of law and there's a scale, what a lawyer, a defense attorney, or the district attorney, the prosecutor does is try and weigh down one side of the scale with evidence, enough evidence to persuade a judge or a jury that, you know, something is legitimate. Now, it doesn't mean that they also don't use emotional appeals, especially if there's a jury. Emotional appeals, and when you're writing argumentation, should be used sparingly because they can backfire. If someone feels manipulated because you've appealed to their emotions, then you know, or sort of it feels heavy-handed, then what happens is it calls into question your credibility as a you know, an arguer. Okay, so, and then finally, ethical appeals honestly are very difficult. This is the appeal to someone's sense of right or wrong, to their standards, and that this ethical appeals only work, and of course it's ethos, it's, you know, our ethics, our sense of morality, right and wrong, and so forth. That only works if we have common ground. So for example, if you were a very religious person and you wanted to argue a point from a religious perspective, but your audience is not religious, it's not going to be effective. All right. If your audience does share your value systems, then that's a different thing entirely. So ethical appeals honestly should be used sparingly, and only, again, if you know that your target audience shares your sense of ethics. If you're not a very, if you're a very patriotic person and you are appealing on the grounds of certain types of patriotism, my country, right or wrong, this kind of thing, but your audience doesn't feel that way, then your argument's not going to be effective. And that's the whole point of the paper, is to get somebody to agree with you, right, if at all possible, or at least to consider your side. You don't want to turn them off immediately, in other words, to your subject matter. There will be a handout about writing. I think there already is, about deductive versus inductive. I'll talk more about this when I go over your drafts individually and sort of walk you through if you are not quite sure how to do this. There's already a little handout in the Week 9 folder that talks about how to arrange your information. The audience, please quit using contractions, isn't, wasn't, couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, and so forth. Some of you are writing really good papers, but you are lowering the diction by being too informal. So please remember to up the level just a little bit. You do need to evaluate your source material. That means your information needs to be reliable. Again, that's the reason I'm requiring a minimum of 3 sources come from the GNTC databases. Often students think the easiest way to do this is to get on Google, put in their search term, and pick the first few sources that they find. And what I've found is that a lot of students often get themselves into trouble doing it that way if they try to rely totally on Google or Bing or Safari or something like that. So that's the reason I'm requiring a minimum of 3 sources. Documentation, we're using APA. I still have students who are turning in papers with MLA formats. That will not fly. Please notice, I will not pass a paper. I cannot pass a paper that contains anything that's plagiarized. But that's the great thing about getting a draft in, is that I can take a look at it and make sure that you're not running into that kind of a problem. And I will not pass a paper if it's MLA, because again, we've been working on APA formats for 5 weeks now, 4 to 5 weeks. Avoid fallacies, which are it's faulty logic, it's errors in reasoning, and there's a little fallacies assignment that's due Monday night. All right, diction again, standard American English, elevate, and so forth. All right, so the draft of this paper is due Monday. That's not a lot of turnaround time. Again, I can take the draft probably a little bit later than that. This is the one assignment, because we're out of time, that I'm willing to do that. But you need to email me in advance, okay, and let me know that you're going to need extra time on it. Then my recorded and written feedback will be available next Thursday after 4 o'clock, probably sooner than that. I will get to these papers immediately next week. And then the final paper is due Monday the 25th. Again, I can take that maybe 1 to 2 days later, as long as you're communicating with me via email. But I have to have it graded and grades in by Friday morning, so I don't have a lot of extensions I can give you. This paper to me is kind of like, you've noticed I haven't given you tests. There have been a few reading check quizzes, but I haven't given you tests in this class. And I don't give you a final exam, and there was no midterm. To me, this last paper is the final exam, because it shows me everything you've learned throughout the semester about writing, how to have a good introduction, how to have a thesis and stick to it, how to use good transitions, how to find reliable source material, how to document that material in a research paper, and so forth. All right, I'm going to pause there before we move on. Any questions? Okay, I'm not going to, let's see, we're not going to do this because you've already seen this PowerPoint. It was in last week's, folder. And the visuals don't upload, unfortunately, in Blackboard Collaborate, so I'm not going to go over it. I kind of summarized it for you before. 85% of the information you bring in should be fact-based. Eyewitness testimony, experts, not just opinions, because again, the thing is we all have one, but if it's expert opinion, if it's someone who has that's their field, this is their area of study or expertise, that's one thing. And that's considered logos, that's considered logic, reasons, field research, I mentioned statistics, examples, hypothetical examples can be examples of logos, of logic. It's very data driven. So 85% of the information you find shouldn't appeal to people's emotions. Now, granted, there's some overlap. For example, I had a student who was writing about the the cell phone laws back before they tightened them in Georgia, the fact that they needed to be tightened, that they were contributing to too many accidents. And he did his paper on research that showed why, and so forth. And so he would use examples of people who died reaching for their cell or on their cell phone. Now that is supposed to appeal to our emotions, obviously, but it's also fact-based. This did happen, and they were literally texting when they hit the tree, so it wasn't just used to kind of inflame us or make us upset or shocked or whatever, which is what emotional appeals do. All right, so let's talk about a little bit about this, and then we'll finish up by me showing you in Primo how to find the best information. During the planning stage of research writing, you begin with a question. The answer to the question is your tentative thesis or claim. This is what you want to answer. That's the reason I had you ask questions in your issue proposal. These are the things that is supposed to sort of stimulate your thinking, like, okay, what do I want to find out? While I'm not going to have you do an annotated bibliography because we don't have time. If this were a 15-week class, this is one assignment I cut out. You're welcome. Because if this were a 15-week class, you would be doing an annotated bibliography where you have to go through and think through your source material and so forth. All right, and speaking of source material, whenever possible, use primary sources. Primary sources are sources that contain first-hand information. Diaries are primary sources. someone who does original research and publishes their findings. Those are primary sources. Secondary sources are other people writing about primary sources, okay? And then, of course, you can do your own field research. Now, remember that you want the most credible information with which to build your paper. So again, Credo reference, articles found in Primo. You don't have time to use books. Please don't look at books, although occasionally some books are arranged where you can just take a chapter out of it, and that's okay, but you don't have time to read books, so you're looking for articles primarily. I'm going to show you a database called Facts on File in the GNTC library. We pay for it, and a lot of students find it to be useful because it presents both sides of an issue. It doesn't argue one side or the other. It presents information on both sides. And especially if students have trouble coming up with a particular topic, this was a good place to start. Other possibilities, Google Scholar. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I know a lot of high school students use Google Scholar. So if you're in Google or some other search engine and you type in Google Scholar, it will take you to a database that Google maintains that's more academic. It's more elevated material that's kind of been curated for this purpose. And so that's another source, but I find it harder to use, quite frankly, than the Primo, and I'm going to show you why. Never, ever, 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 ever build a paper using Wikipedia unless the instructor tells you to do so. And I'm sure most of you are warned about this if you've had high school English within the past 25 years. And the reason is because a wiki is a public site. That's what a wiki is by nature. It's a public site that you can go to and edit. I can go to and edit. The public is invited to contribute information if you have solid information, and then Wikipedia employs a lot of editors who go through and try to verify. But Wikipedia is good for a few things. For example, you can find search terms. Now, you don't want to quote from Wikipedia in your paper. You don't want to use it as a source, but you can definitely kind of find search terms there. And good Wikipedia sites at the very end always have a bibliography with a bunch of their secondary sources, right? So they have all their primary sources listed at the end. All of these sources were used to put together this wiki. And so you can actually go and find those primary sources and use those. I'm not going to take the time to show you, but feel free to, look online and find it. Okay. All right, so now I want to end this session by showing you, give me just a second to set it up, in the library, how to go about conducting research using the databases. I'm going to take this a little step beyond what you had to do for the library scavenger hunt. So we're going to stop this, and again, there's a little bit of lag time here as it switches. And if I lose you here, if it doesn't show up on your screen, please be aware that it will be on the recording. I'm verifying that now. Okay, hope you can see that, but there's our library homepage. I got there, of course, under my resources on the GNTC website, and then just scroll down to library. And we're going to select Primo, and I'm going to start there. Now, Primo is not a database. Primo is a search engine of databases of all of the holdings, in addition to all of the books that are on the shelves and the 6 different campuses at GNTC. So let's just say that I want to, in my paper, tentatively what I want to do is argue that children under the age of 12 should not be allowed to have cell phones. Okay, so I'm going to use cell phones and children. I'm going to, now I could select advanced search here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go ahead and just select this. And notice that it comes back with 78,000 hits. All right. Okay, it's taking a minute. Hopefully it will show that. It may not show that page, so let me Again, this can be very clumsy. Because there's a little bit of lag time between when I set it up and when it shows. All right, so it's appeared on my screen, so that means the recording will have it. So what I've got here is our 78,000 hits, okay? Now, I don't know if you noticed this last time, but you can filter your results. That means you can add some filters to try and be more specific about what you want. So, for example, I want to make sure that I don't want just like little summaries of something. I want the actual article, so select full text online. I'm not requiring that you use peer-reviewed journals. Format, newspaper articles and regular articles. I'm going to select those two. All right, scrolling down here. Location, I don't care because I'm not going to check it out. It's going to be online. Subject, no. Creator. Creation date. I don't want old information. I want, and probably most of your topics, you're going to want the latest and greatest, right? Probably within the last 5 years. So I'm going to change this to, let's just say, 2017 till now. All right, now that I've selected all of those different filters, I'm going to choose this green box, apply filters. All right, now I'm down to 22,000, that's better. And at this point, what I need to do is just scroll through here and see what I can find. Giving children cell phones, encouraging emotions, that sounds weird. School aid, federal prison, nope, nope. American Academy of Pediatrics Research. All right, how about this? Parents don't know how much their children use cell phones or tablets. I'm going to select that. Okay. Now, this isn't the article yet. It hasn't appeared. But notice that I've got, it says full text is available. I want to view it online, so I'm going to select that in a minute. But notice here, I can send it to a reading list. I can export it. I can print it. Here's my citation tool. This is one of the beautiful things, one of the two beautiful things about using the GNTC databases. The first is that you can know the information is reliable, so you, the researcher, do not have to evaluate it. The second is it does the citations for you. Or you can email it to yourself. All right, so I'm going to select citation. And then notice down here, the default was MLA. I want APA 7th edition because, of course, we're using APA. Now, all I have to do is copy and paste this into my references page, and there I have it. Okay? So copy the citation to clipboard, and I've got it in case I use this article. All right, then view online. Notice it's asking me to sign in. All you have to do is sign in here, and if it asks you if it can keep your data or whatever, just tell it no. It's still going to let you through, okay? So please don't let the sign in slow you down. The sign in is your same single sign-on that you use to get into my GNTC email and so forth, okay? And this is how you can access the article. All right, so going back then to, I want to go back to one other thing I want to show you, facts on file, and then we'll be done. I'll answer any questions you have. But going back to the GNTC library, and again, this is going to take a second, so my apologies. It should come into view any minute. The way that you get to facts on file is a little bit different. You need to go to databases A to Z right here, okay? If you select that, because it doesn't automatically show up in Primo, so if you select databases A to Z, all right, scroll down because we want F, open that, and facts on file, issues and controversies. All right, this is going to take a second. Again, I'm going to have to go back and show it specifically. All right, the page has appeared on my screen. So this is what the page of the database, the home page of the database looks like. What Issues and Controversies does is it takes controversial issues, all right, so they're debatable, there are two sides to them, and presents both sides. Okay. Now, again, if you're having trouble coming up with the topic, or if the topic you're using is not going to work, this is a great place to find topics. I do want to quickly mention, do not build an entire article, entire paper off of the information you find on Facts on File. You need to branch out more than that, because part of the goal of this assignment is to give you a lot of practice with research methodology, and sticking with one database is not a good idea. All right. But I'm going to show you the options here. If you scroll down, issues by subject, notice that it has all of these different categories: crime, law and judicial, drugs, alcohol, and so forth. You can click on those, and underneath those, it will have underneath each category, it will have subtopics. It will have, you know, hundreds of subtopics. This can help you narrow it down. But I already know that my topic is going to be cell phones and children. So I'm going to see if this has anything. This database contains any information. All right, cellular telephones. If cellular telephones had a positive influence on modern society. Texting while driving. Well, that's not kids. Mandatory vaccinations, have no clue what that's about. So let's try this first one. Now, this is the setup for a typical Facts on File article. Now, what's important though is make sure that it's not too old. Notice that this was last updated 2007. So I honestly probably would not want to use this information. It's too old. There's too much more current research that's been done. But I do want to show you the format. There's always a pro side and a con side, and it's summarized right here. Supporters argue, opponents argue, and so they're the two arguments, and then it presents both sides. So in other words, this is not an argumentative report. It simply is a secondary source that puts together a lot of primary sources. It is reliable, and it presents both sides of an issue. Usually contains tables and so forth that you could actually include in a paper. And then at the very end, it's got a bibliography where you can find more sources, because again, this is a secondary source that's built off of all of these primary sources. All right, makes sense? And so you could actually find some primary sources here if something interested you. Now, the tricky part about this, the only sort of downside to Facts on File, is the citation. At the very bottom, let's say copy URL. They used to provide a additional sources, discussion questions. It looks like they've even quit doing the, oh, here, there's the citation tool there. They've moved it. All right, citation, and they're doing APA again. That's wonderful, because it used to be they only gave you MLA. So I hope you saw where I went there, but it again, all you have to do, should you use information from a source that you found on Facts on File, Issues and Controversies, all you have to do is copy and paste. And this is very accessible information. One of the things that you may find, this will be my last comment, one of the things that you may find when you're doing research in Primo is that it will provide you with a lot of very technical articles. If you can't understand the language, if it's written at that very formal level for a very specific audience, do not waste your time with it. Okay, move on to something else, because it's you know, you have to really understand something, the entire article, to be able to quote from it well. That's good research methodology. And if the language is too complicated, if it's heavily researched for a niche audience, then I would move on. The great thing about issues and controversies, and again, you don't want to use it, you know, have 5 different issues and controversies articles for your source material, but 1 or 2 is fine. And it's very accessible. It's written in a way that's easy to understand. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop there. Do you have any questions for me? All right, if not, I hope you have a good afternoon. Please don't hesitate to email me with questions if you've got them. And